also kind of related thread to studies in the unresolved positivism.
Yeah.
In Barfield's terms, would be this the Cartesian situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, that's where positivism would in some ways stem from, right? The view of science as this process of purifying something called matter from mind and from spirit and or from soul. And Descartes gets a lot of critiques these days, and yet the very act of critique is itself a Cartesian gesture. And so how do we think about our situation?
Well, so if you think about Descartes as not necessarily producing, his articulations aren't necessarily what have caused this, so something that's distinct from a causal history of ideas, and instead to think of Descartes as, his articulations as, being emblematic of the zeitgeist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there's you can, if you look at it as a morphology, then there's you could say a contraction of consciousness, towards the center and away from the world, and there's this simultaneous objectification of the world through perspective and the coordinate plane, and then the increasing manipulation of the physical world, and then simultaneous further alienation from it.
Right.
And so it's you could imagine it as this process of being kind of united with the periphery and then contracting to the center out of connection with it.
Yeah, so Descartes is a very articulate symptom of a shared, a collective historical moment in the morphogenetic history of consciousness. And he didn't create the situation, but he's giving philosophical voice to it. Yeah. So we shouldn't blame him for anything. But I also think I don't know. I was just thinking about the ways in which he was pretty insightful, actually, and that rather than being unresolved Cartesian dualists or implicit Cartesian dualists like so many materialists are, it might be better to just proudly inherit Descartes and his brilliance, in particular when it comes to how he reframes the ontological proof of the existence of God. It's not an ontological proof so much in Descartes as it is a phenomenological description of the way in which we meet our own finitude as subjects. You're finite, right? You're limited and you make mistakes and you get tired, you age, you die one day, So you're a finite being, and he just reflected on his experience of being finite and realized in the background, implied by our own limit and finitude, is this idea of the infinite, and that we can only know ourselves as finite because this idea of the infinite is there, just scintillating in the background, giving us to be. And for him, that was an experiential opening that let him out of his skeptical nightmare and put him back into contact with the world and other people through God. He found this trap door at the edges of his own soul and fell through it into the divine. And we forget the element of Descartes' meditations that were spiritual exercise. We get fixed on the sort of methodological techniques that one could extract from his meditations.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It's the way people are initially trained to read something, and then reading philosophy, actually reading any historical text. I mean, you have to, like, people are not taught hermeneutics, I guess, is what I'm saying.
No. Yeah. I mean, that's like the reason people think philosophy has no value, no utility value in our society is because, you know, it's
positivist.
It's not about getting something for yourself or improving the efficiency by which an economy functions, right? Philosophy is about caring for oneself, transforming oneself. Like, you can't use philosophy because the very nature of the subject who might use it is what's being called into question by the act of philosophizing.
Yeah.
And, you know, Descartes is just such a wonderful example of the way that the love of wisdom can inhabit a human soul and give rise to all these ideas, but also, I think, successfully remind us of the infinite ground. And, of course, Descartes interprets it in his own Catholic context, but
yeah, I was
thinking, do it differently, too.
When you initially mentioned that, I was thinking about how in Plato and others among the Greeks, the infinite was like something like that was, I mean, like,
kind of frightening.
Yeah, frightening.
Irrational.
Yeah, exactly. The unbound, the unbounded.
Apeiron.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that and just like what has, you know, the whole, I guess, stream between that and Descartes and how this experience of God as, you know, having the aspect of infinite.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it's almost this process of incarnation, right? Whereas Plato was...
It's like full life.
Plato was perfectly comfortable to see the divine nous acting cosmically.
Yeah.
Like radiating down from heaven. And by the time of Descartes, there's this incarnational metamorphosis which has unfolded through history. The divine nous is now being... Like, Descartes just openly identifying with it. And, you know, Plotinus was already... And Plato already kind of doing this too, but... It just became so much more individualized and made almost mundane by Descartes' epistemological maneuver. He was saying, look, like, all human beings can follow the light of reason in themselves and arrive at certain knowledge of nature. Here's how you do it. Here's the method, right? First, you establish your own self as a thinking being, and then establish that you can accurately measure an extended material world using these mathematical models. You become the divine intellect, you know?
Yes.
Just like Copernicus taking the perspective of the sun on the solar system, incarnating the solar logos to view the earth as if from outside. Descartes does epistemologically, and Kant to what Copernicus did astronomically.
So what is it to do it from the earth?
Well,
epistemologically,
that's the challenge, is after the transcendental maneuver to then descend again back to the earth.
And to integrate it.
To integrate the geocentric and heliocentric.
I guess that's sort of what Steiner was describing in the interdisciplinary astronomy course. It's one of the coolest lecture series of his that I've listened to.
Because you have to accept that the earth is moving.
Yeah, and then also the sun is moving, and the moon is moving.
Right.
and they're all moving. They also have other movements as well, right? Like rotating on axes and then there's like relationships between the different planets in their movements. It's so complex. I was thinking when Turget was, speaking about like the way in which theorists of the paranormal will kind of, like use whatever their preferences or like conceive of it in strings or waves or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of something like the music of the spheres.
Yeah.
Oh, he was talking about interference
Yeah.
patterns, that like that's what entities, that's how we can describe them according to the language of that kind of observation so far, as interference patterns. And so then that makes you think about like, well, just the fact that, you know, it's mutable, right? Like Whitehead's creativity, everything's in flux.
Right. But not just chaotically. There's rhythm and melody and harmony and
like profoundly ancient rhythms. At least as far as our species, you know, is concerned, like profoundly ancient.
And so Descartes clearly hadn't lost touch with the infinite ground of his own being, that he realized just out of sheer grace gave him to be, that he's totally dependent of. His independence depends on the infinite ground. But soon after, you know, the rise of science that he birthed, materialism takes over and the infinite ground gets totally forgotten or belittled and sort of sentimentalized, and sort of it's like made irrelevant to our scientific search for the truth, and totally disconnected from any sense of being oriented toward the good. Truth becomes this sort of sovereign value.
Well, it's just about, truth is basically just facts. What are called facts.
Right.
That's what a truth is reduced to. Because there's like an underlying nihilism today. There's not, because of the relativism.
And how do we overcome that? Like,
that's it. Reattune to the world.
Attunement. But we've all become so tone deaf.
Yeah, it's like consciousness is really contracted.
Maybe,
especially into the devices that are sort of like a second nature.
Yeah.
You know, because they're based in mechanism, apart from what we bring to them.
Yeah.
So it kind of like, isn't that interesting? It's like an extreme contraction.
Yeah. Well, that's the danger of the Cartesian ego. If it becomes untethered from the infinite ground, then it's just the ego versus the machine.
Away and stares into the machine.
Yeah, maybe this is like Spinoza's correction of Descartes.